I've told this to a select few, and while creepiest is subjective in the context of my life, it is truly the creepiest and scariest unsolved mystery. I was a freshman in high school in my hometown of La Crosse, Wisconsin. I was sleeping over at my friend Tom's house. We were watching a movie in his living room when he suddenly got a phone call. I watched as he listened to what was being said on the other line. I watched as emotion poured over his face as he threw the phone across the room. After moments of crying, he told me that a boy at my school had committed suicide. Now, I knew this boy only through seeing him in the halls. My friend Tom and I didn't go to the same high school, but Tom had gone to middle school with this boy. Apparently, Tom bullied him during those years. He wasn't proud of it, and to be honest, I was pretty surprised because he was a great guy. He had utter remorse. We decided to sneak out and go for a walk. The year was roughly 1990, maybe 1991. We were freshmen in high school. Now, sneaking out was nothing new, we always did it. At the time, we weren't into drugs, alcohol, or partying. We just liked the freedom of walking the streets at night. The discussions were always great. Normally, we'd go walk through the big cemetery that was near my house. It was behind the train tracks that ran through the La Crosse to this day. We loved the danger of the cemetery, the scares. We were kids, it was a rite of passage. As we walked along the train tracks leading to the cemetery, we stopped. To this day, I can't explain why. We had walked in that cemetery dozens of times, and on scarier nights. For whatever reason, we didn't want to go in there. I don't know if it was the thought of death on our minds due to our classmate's suicide. Perhaps. Regardless, without really saying anything to each other, we stopped, turned around, and decided to head down a nearby street. Now, in retrospect, I do have to say that throughout this walk, things seemed off. There wasn't a car in sight. This was suburbia. Even walking through the town's main street was odd, because there just weren't any cars. Odd. It was roughly after midnight. It was a weekend night. Where was everybody? Perhaps just a strange coincidence? Lastly, there was something in the air. Both Tom and I felt it. We even brought it up. It just feels weird tonight. The air, the lights. So we decided to walk down a dead-end street. At the end of the street was a ditch with a simple up, down, and up trail that led to the street I lived on. Simple enough. Keep in mind as I get into the horrifying part of the story that we were in the suburbs. These weren't old creepy houses with strange individuals, and all the trees were small. It wasn't a brand new development, but it wasn't that old either. So as Tom and I are walking down the street, we're looking down to the road beneath our feet as we talk. I don't remember the exact conversation of this particular moment. Perhaps we were talking about the tragedy of that night, but it could have just as been easily about Star Wars or Akira. As we approached the dead end, which was a few houses away, Tom and I suddenly stopped. We did so at the same time, without saying one word to each other. Our heads turned slowly towards each other, both sensing something. The hair on our arms and the back of our necks standing high. Then our gaze slowly moved forward in unison, slightly to the right. That's when we saw it. About 2 houses away, in a virtually barren front yard of a suburban home beside some bushes, was a dark figure. It was someone or something in dark robes. No face, no features at all, just the robe. Now, this figure didn't acknowledge us, not yet. It instead walked or moved in a certain way. I can't articulate it correctly, as if it was walking in circles slowly, without really walking. It held something that was blowing in the wind, and yes, the wind picked up a little bit as well. Another odd element was the light that illuminated it somewhat. There was a streetlight a few houses up, but it wasn't strong enough to illuminate this figure as it was. Tom and I were frozen. In fact, I'm almost frozen as I write this. It's been a while since I thought about this night. So there we stood, frozen in fear, staring at this dark figure's moving, yet doing so without moving, and it was holding something. Or perhaps what was blowing in the wind was more of its robe, I'm not sure. We stared at this thing for I don't know how long, until it stopped and suddenly looked up at us, as if finally alarmed by our presence. That was enough for us. We ran away as fast as we could. We cut through a side street that was to lead us to a parallel street towards my neighborhood. This street led to a slight hill. As we rounded the corner and started running up the hill in a panic, we stopped, because on top of that hill, we saw another dark figure with its arms raised. We turned around and ran in the direction of Tom's house, which at this distance was at least 5 miles away. We ran. Time stood still. The next thing I remember, we're lying in the middle of a courtyard of some other neighborhood that we'd never been in, gasping for breath. We sat up and, without saying a word, we walked in silence back to his house. The air felt normal again, although we felt like we were in a haze of sorts, albeit out of danger. We fell asleep in his house. I woke up that morning and went home. A few days later, I rode my bike to the location. Perhaps it was shadow play. Perhaps there was a certain tree or bush or maybe a for sale sign or something that made it look like there was something else there. Nothing. It was an open yard. Tom and I didn't speak of that night for a long time. Years later, when I brought it up, he replied, "Yeah, what the heck was that?" As if no time had passed. What was it? I have no idea. We hadn't taken any drugs. We hadn't been drinking any alcohol. I often wonder if it could have been a haunting, a specter, a ghost, etc. Maybe it was an alien abduction or sighting. We saw no crap, but there was some unexplained light. Or maybe it was some other kids messing with us. But how would they have known we were coming? How could they be so prepared? I just don't know. That was roughly 24 years ago, give or take. And yes, this is a true story. Sadly, my best friend Tom passed suddenly a few months ago. I thought of this night during his funeral. I thought of returning to that site. I thought of the odd coincidence of unexpected and surprising death, just like my classmate that night. Is there a connection? Were we seeing some future fate for one of us, which sadly fell upon my best friend Tom? Was this all some dual hallucination? It haunts me at times. One night when I was 10, I was asleep in bed and was woken up by my bedroom door opening, then someone sitting on my bed. I felt the graze on my leg and the bed sink as they sat. Thinking it was my mom having something to tell me, I opened my eyes only to see a pale, eyeless, just black, empty eye sockets boy who seemed to be my age, sitting at the foot of my bed with his legs crossed, staring at me, or facing my direction since he had no eyes. He then reached his hand toward me, and he was holding what looked like a little black box. I was freaked out, but as I reached to grab it, he hesitantly pulled back. I reached out further for it and said, "Give it." As I did so, I blinked, and by the time I reopened my eyes, he was gone. The spot of the bed where he was sitting lifted back into place, but the imprint of someone sitting there was still present. I told my mom in the morning, and she was slightly freaked, but assured me I was just dreaming. Fast forward 5 years. I had my girlfriend over to do homework. After homework, she took a nap while she waited for her parents to pick her up. When they arrived, I tried waking her to let her know. I nudged her, and she opened her eyes so sudden, already looking in the direction of the corner of the room, where the wall meets the ceiling, lifting her finger and pointed. And as fast as she woke, she fell asleep again. I attempted to wake her again. She came to full consciousness, and I asked her what that was about, and explained what she just did. She said, "Oh, I thought I was dreaming, but up on the wall I saw a little boy with no eyes, just there in a Spider-Man pose staring at me." That's when I freaked out, and I told her the story, for the first time, of when I saw what I guessed was the same kid. Fast forward another 5 years, still with the same girlfriend, and by this time we had a 2-year-old daughter. We were living in the old bedroom at my parents' house. My daughter would wake up at the same time every night and start talking. For a while we thought it was a normal baby thing, until I noticed it was almost the same conversation every night. I playfully asked her one night who she was talking to every night. She responded, "A little boy. He talks to me. He's nice. He's lost and looking for his mommy." I told my mom what happened the next morning, and before I got to tell her what I thought, she said, "I remember when that happened to you, then your girlfriend. I have no idea what that is." By then, neither my girlfriend or I have seen the little boy after our first encounter, but my daughter continued her nightly conversations until we got our own place later that year. When my wife and I bought our first house, an old Victorian style built in the 50s, almost every night we heard what sounded like a kid's footsteps running down the upstairs hallway and other random sounds. My wife mentioned it to one of the neighbors, and they said it was probably just peacocks on the roof. The house backed up to a conservation area where wild peacocks lived, and they would occasionally get up on the rooftops. That answer made sense, so we basically got used to it and eventually ignored it. Less than a year later, our son was born, and when he was 1, he would balance all of his toys on top of other toys and make them spin. Literally found the center of balance of various toys and would walk in a circle around the room, giving each a gentle touch to keep it rotating. It was the weirdest and coolest thing I had ever seen. When he was 2 or 3, we would hear him talking in his room at night, and one night I asked who he was talking to. He said, "Tracy." I asked, "Who is Tracy?" And he says, "The girl who lives in the wall. She's usually nice, but sometimes she scares me." He described a girl with brown hair and a yellow dress who would play with him sometimes, and occasionally wake him up at night, but he didn't seem bothered by any of it, just startled sometimes. He would talk about her once in a while, but it wasn't a common occurrence. A couple years later, we had added on to the house and moved the master bedroom downstairs, switching the kids' rooms around. Our youngest was now in his old room, and about ready to transition from crib to toddler bed. She had always been a sound sleeper, but she cried almost every night in that room. Her first night in the toddler bed, we heard a loud thud followed by screaming and rushed into the room, thinking she had fallen out of bed. She was on the other side of the room. Got her calmed down and back to bed, and it happened again the next night. So we ended up switching the kids' rooms back, and they were fine. We looked up the history of the house, but didn't find anything about any missing little girls or anyone with the name Tracy that had lived there. Eventually, our son stopped talking about her, and a few years later, I ended up taking a job with another company and we moved. The house was empty for a few months after we moved, and the neighbor across the street called my wife one day. Said about a week after we left, she thought she saw our daughter looking out the window, so she waved to her. And then she remembered we didn't live in there anymore. This is one my dad told me. When he and his brother were younger, they took a job to clean out some old lady's attic. The lady lived in a regular one-story house with a normal attic space. The kind where you can't stand up fully. You have to stoop down and crawl everywhere. She had been hearing animals moving around and wanted some of her stuff pulled out of there before it got chewed up. For some reason, the attic only had one crawl space, and it was in the living room off to one side. So they pulled up a folding ladder and put it underneath, and my uncle climbed up and pushed the door up. He popped his head through, and the attic was an exact replica of the living room underneath it, complete with lighting and doorways leading to who knows where. My dad was standing underneath. Looking up, he could tell something wasn't right by the light and the way the roof looked too far up, like getting vertigo. My uncle closed the door, apologized to the lady, and they both took off. My dad said that his brother wouldn't talk to him until they were about a mile away. He just saw that look on his face, and when his brother said, "We've got to go," he didn't argue. Hey everyone, Dismal Hero here, and I'd like to thank you for checking out the video. Please subscribe if you haven't already, like and share the video if you enjoyed it. I'm always looking for new and exciting stories, so if you have a scary encounter that has happened to you, please email it to me in the link in my description. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you back here again next time.